Chapter 14, 13 Miracles. There are some who may question my use of the term miracles here, but in light of the extraordinary circumstances that unfolded as we lived through the ordeal of bankruptcy protection, I choose to call them miracles. When we went into court protection, the odds were that Shermax would not survive because I had no money to inject into the business and there was no white knight or outside investor to bail us out. In order to survive, a series of miracles had to happen. If any one of them had not happened or had not happened at the right time, we would have gone into bankruptcy. But they did happen, and all of them happened when they needed to happen. From my perspective, the moon and the stars aligned in our favor, and every one of those happenings was an individual miracle. To a large extent, the miracles happened because Shermax had a strong foundation of goodwill and a solid reputation as a fair and honorable organization. We also had excellent relationships with our employees, landlords, and suppliers. As things turned out, many of them were willing to go to great lengths and take substantial risks to support us and help us survive. No one wanted to see us go down, but there was a lot of turmoil amongst our creditors. Creditors. I was not the only one who was devastated by our being forced into bankruptcy protection. All of our suppliers were faced with the prospect of not being paid, and for some of them, that was crucial to their survival. Phil Cohen. Phil Cohen had been in the garment industry forever. As I recall, he had retired, but he and his wife had recently come back into business to help their two sons start a new company. We had recently hired a new buyer, Lisa Miller, who had done business with the Cohens in her previous job. After she joined Shermax, she placed a large order, about $400,000, with their company. Up until then, our credit rating had been excellent, and we had a reputation for always paying our bills. So as far as the Cohens knew, our credit rating was absolutely fine. Their full order was delivered the day before the axe fell. The day after the news broke, Mr. Cohen came to see me. He was visibly distressed and asked, "How could this happen? My wife and I and our two boys are working very hard to try to make this business work. We don't have $400,000 to lose. I don't know how we are going to survive. This could put us out of business and throw my boys out on the street. How could this happen?" The truth is, there wasn't much I could say. I was in shock myself. Somehow, despite the circumstances, he believed me when I told him that this turn of events was totally unexpected and that I was as distressed as he was. Although Phil and I had never met before, we somehow connected amidst all the turmoil, and he decided to try to help me. He became my ally and a true supporter. In fact, he made sure that he got himself on the creditors committee so that he could support me. I will always be grateful to Phil Cohen for his support. After we came out of protection and were credit worthy again, I made sure to direct as much business as I could to the Cohens, as I did with most of the suppliers who had been hurt as a result of our difficulties. I am pleased to say that Mr. Cohen and his sons not only survived that episode, but also went on to become a thriving business. CAMA. CAMA was a specialty store construction company owned by three brothers who had just started their business. They did beautiful work and their prices were very competitive. We were one of their first customers. We had given them a contract to build 6 stores to launch the new concepts we had developed for Time Eternity and Addition L. We owed CAMA $800,000 when we went into protection. That was an enormous amount of money for a new company. They too knew us as a high-profile, credit-worthy company and had not asked us for a deposit before they started the project, so they had not received any payment for their work. When the axe fell, two of the brothers came to see me. They were very upset and they did not know how they would survive such a loss. I could do nothing more than sit with them and listen and try to explain what had happened. I tried to assure them that there was never any intention to hurt them, and I guess I convinced them because, again, like Mr. Cohen, they gave me their support. As soon as we started building again, I gave them all of our construction work, which in some measure helped them to become one of the top construction companies in the country. Another supporter. A third example of support came from a supplier who will remain anonymous, but when he reads this, he will know I am referring to him. I would like him to know how much I appreciated his support. He had been one of my suppliers from almost the first day I went into business, and I owed him around $500,000. On the fateful day we filed for protection, he called me and said, "Max, you are going to have to make an offer to your creditors, and they're going to press you to make as high an offer as they can persuade you to make. If there is any hope of you to survive this, you need to resist them and make an offer that will give you a chance to survive." Even though that advice would cost him, I guess he was convinced that I had acted with integrity and he wanted to see me survive. These are just a few examples of the many suppliers who gave us their support at that most difficult time. There were, however, many other negative cases too, where creditors were very angry and upset with me. Under the circumstances, I certainly understand how they felt. The miracles. Miracle number 1, amendments to the Canadian Bankruptcy Act. In the fall of 1992, the Canadian economy was in a major recession. Many companies across Canada were going bankrupt, and in an effort to help them survive, the federal government changed the Canadian Bankruptcy Act to make it possible for a company to cancel a lease by paying 6 months' rent as a penalty. Although we didn't know it at the time, this new legislation would give us a bargaining chip with our landlords. Had the legislation not come into effect when it did, the outcome of our negotiations with our landlords would have been very difficult. We would probably not have received their support, and they would not have made the concessions they eventually did. That legislation was our first miracle in the making, and it turned out to be crucial to our survival. Miracle number 2, a bad strategy turns good. In an effort to minimize our losses when our business was spiraling downward, we kept reducing our inventories. However, we eventually got to the point at which our reduced inventories were contributing to the downward spiral. So for the 1993 fall and holiday seasons, in a desperate attempt to stop the downward spiral, we decided to increase our inventories dramatically so we could offer better and different assortments to our customers. Also, we had experimented with expensive brand name merchandise in a few stores and it had sold well. But we made a serious mistake in thinking that we could sell that merchandise in all of our stores, and we bought lots of it. As it turned out, we could not change our customers' buying habits in one season. That expensive brand name merchandise was not saleable to the mass market, and the merchandise backed up on us. All of this excess inventory became the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. On the downside, buying all that merchandise used up our credit completely and precipitated the stop credit on our account issued by the factors. However, on the upside, after we had filed for protection and could not get any new product, Having all of that merchandise on hand meant we had product to sell and turn into cash, and that gave us the cash flow we needed to keep us afloat until we could start buying again. So the miracle here was that our bad strategy actually helped to save us. Miracle number 3, Jacques Rossignol. Several months before we had to file for protection, James Landry had dragged me very reluctantly to get some advice from a bankruptcy trustee. I was reluctant because I was convinced that such advice was unnecessary and that the Christmas season would turn things around for us. But James was worried and he insisted we have the meeting. He also felt it was important that we speak to a trustee who was outside the industry, someone who had no ties to any of our creditors and therefore had no conflict of interest. On the day we had to file for protection, James and the trustee had to get some documents signed by our lawyers before going to the courthouse. Our lawyers were the firm of Lapointe Rosenstein, of which my brother Alex was a founding partner. While they were at the office, quite by accident, they ran into Jacques Rossignol, the firm's bankruptcy lawyer, who asked James what they were doing there. James told him they were on their way to court to file for protection. Jacques then cautioned James that the trustee who was with him did not have the clout to take on the fashion industry and that it would be suicide for Shermax to file without first informing and consulting with the bank and finding a trustee with whom the bank would be comfortable. James took Jacques' advice and immediately terminated our arrangement with the trustee. Jacques took over the case on the spot and went to court with James to file for bankruptcy protection. In retrospect, there is absolutely no doubt that if we had gone with our original trustee, we would never have got to first base with our creditors and the bank. He did not have the stature we needed. The creditors would have steamrolled over him and the bank would have closed our account. Jacques Rossignol, on the other hand, was very well known to our creditors as a tough negotiator and a force to be reckoned with. He was just the person we needed to represent us. So James Landry's chance meeting with Jacques Rossignol at a critical moment, Jacques' intervention, and his decision to take over was indeed a miracle. I can't imagine that we would have survived without him handling our case. Miracle number 4, credibility with the landlords. After studying our financial situation, Jacques came to me and said, "Max, you cannot save this company without putting some money back into it. You have to put $4 million into the business. We need that much to sustain our cash flow." I said, "Jacques, I have no money to put in. I have 2 homes and a few small investments, but that's all. They don't add up to nearly enough." He then told me we couldn't even get started without the $4 million. A short time later, he came back to me and said, "Since you don't have the money, we'll have to go to the landlords and get considerations from them that are equivalent to $4 million. "Jacques, that's impossible," I said. "I cannot get any help from the landlords. I have been asking them for rent relief for months, but they won't even consider it." He replied, "Max, we have no other alternative. We just have to get $4 million from them." Now let me step back for a moment. In early September, just before this crisis, we were having a cash flow problem, and I had written to the landlords telling them of our difficulties. I asked them to allow us to defer payment on October rents to October 20th and our November rents until November 15th. I promised we would catch up in December. They all agreed. By the end of September, our cash flow turned out to be better than anticipated, so we sent out our October rent checks on October 1st, on time, even though we had the landlord's permission to delay until the 20th. The checks were accompanied by a cover letter from me, thanking them for their consideration and explaining that the crunch hadn't come as early as expected and confirming that our November rent checks would be sent on November 15th as agreed. Anyone who knows in advance that they are going into bankruptcy protection would want to protect their cash position to help them later. They certainly would not have paid anything they didn't have to pay. By paying October's rent on time, instead of taking advantage of the agreed-upon deferral, we established a huge amount of credibility with our landlords. It was a clear signal that our filing for protection was not planned and that I was caught as much off guard as they were. The miracle was that by deciding to pay October's rent on time, we gained the trust and goodwill of the landlords, and that contributed to getting them on side when we needed them. Miracle number 5, negotiating with the landlords. Meanwhile, at Jacques Rosignol's insistence, we prepared a plan to take to the landlords to try and get the $4 million we needed in rent relief and other considerations. Our plan included a moratorium on all rent for 3 months, a number of store closures without penalties, and some permanent rent reductions. We knew exactly what we needed from each landlord. Jacques and I first went to see 2 small landlords with whom we had only a few stores. We outlined our plan to restructure Shermax and told them what we needed in terms of support for each of them. We outlined our plan to restructure Shermax and told them what we needed in terms of support from each of them. They both told us they would get back to us, and a few days later both called to tell us they would accept our plan on condition that the landlords who held leases on no fewer than 80% of our stores agreed to the plan as well. We said, "Thank you very much. We appreciate your consideration." We then went to Toronto to see Cambridge and Trilea, 2 of our 3 biggest landlords. We left Cadillac Fairview, our biggest landlord and the one with whom we had the best relations and who we thought would give us the most support, for last. Seymour Obrant, our real estate broker and dear friend, who represented us in finding locations and negotiating leases, joined Jacques and me in our meetings with the landlords. Seymour gave us great support. We met first with Cambridge and then with Trilea and presented our plan. We got the same response from both of them, which was, "We'll consider it and let you know." We heard from both of them within a couple of days with virtually the same responses as those we had received from the 2 smaller landlords. "We are prepared to accept your plan, but only on the condition that the landlords of no fewer than 80% of your stores accept the same plan." It was difficult to believe the same response from all of them was mere coincidence. Anyhow, after receiving those 4 responses, we felt elated and optimistic that we would get the help we needed from our landlords. However, our optimism was short-lived. Cadillac Fairview, the landlord that held leases on 40% of our stores, had recently appointed a new CEO whom I did not know. Rosignol, Obrant, and I met with him and Cadillac's Chief Financial Officer, Peter Sharp, in Toronto. We presented our case, they listened, and when we were finally finished, the CEO said, "Sure, we can support you, but we want shares in the company to compensate us for our shortfall." Without hesitating, I replied, "I cannot do that. If I give you shares, I will have to give the other landlords shares too, and the other creditors will also demand shares along with the landlord of my head office building. If I give everyone shares, I will be lucky if I end up owning 5 or 10% of the company." He said, "Precisely." And I said, "I'm sorry, but I cannot give you shares. As you know, I am taking on an enormous challenge in trying to turn this around. I'm going to have to work very hard and put a huge effort into this if it is going to succeed. I'm not going to do it if I only own 5 or 10% of the company. I would be better off just letting it go." His tone then became very aggressive, and he said, in effect, "Do you think you're going to walk away from this scot-free? You think Trilea's not in trouble? You think you're not in trouble? The whole world is in trouble. Do you have any idea what all the empty stores in our malls is costing us? Where do you think we're getting our funds? You got yourself into this mess. How dare you come in here and expect us to bear the brunt of your problems? It's shares or nothing. And if you're telling me you're not giving us shares, please leave my office." And he got up and walked out. Peter Sharp, who has always been a friend, said, "Max, he's right. We all have our troubles, so you have to decide what you want to do." "Peter, there's nothing I can do," I responded. "I cannot give you shares. All the other landlords have stipulated 80% or no deal, and Cadillac Fairview, which represents 40%, is saying no way. So, Peter, it's all in your hands." Seymour, Jacques, and I left the office, and Jacques and I went back to Montreal. It looked like the game was over, because without the support of the landlords, we could not even begin to put together a plan for restructuring and reorganizing the company. When we got back to Montreal, we arranged a meeting with the trustees, accountants, and lawyers for 2 o'clock the next afternoon to discuss how best to wind up the company. The next morning I called Peter Sharp and told him about the meeting that afternoon to discuss winding up the business, and I wanted him to know that if I did not get the support I needed, it would all be over. He said, "Max, we have nothing to come to the table with. We're asking for shares, and if you won't give us the shares, all I can do is wish you the best of luck." At 2 p.m., we convened our meeting and started to discuss putting everything in motion for an orderly wind-up of the company. The mood was very somber. I was truly at one of my all-time lows. At 2:30, literally at the last moment, a call came through from Peter Sharp, and he said, "Okay, we are in. We accept your plan. Tell the other landlords we're on side." I could barely speak. All I could manage to mutter to everyone was, "Cadillac Fairview is in. We have the landlords on side." What a difference a minute can make. One moment it is all over, the next there's hope again. It was almost impossible for me to contain my excitement. Within minutes, the entire head office went wild. There was pandemonium. People were cheering, crying, hugging, and laughing. The atmosphere in the building was electrifying. All of this was typical of how I would live my life for the next 6 months. One evening I would come home and say to Shirley, "It looks like there's a glimmer of hope." The next evening I would come home and say, "It's game over." We were living on an emotional roller coaster. Getting the landlords on side to the extent that we did was truly another miracle. Without their support, we could not even have begun the process of preparing an offer for acceptance by the creditors. By the way, Peter Sharp, who is now president and CEO of Cadillac Fairview, continued to be a good friend. Miracle number 6, timing in our favor. As I mentioned earlier, several months before we filed for protection, the federal government had passed legislation that allowed leases to be canceled under special circumstances. The coincidence of the timing of that legislation and our filing gave us the bargaining chip we needed with our landlords. Also, in October 1993, the country was virtually at the bottom of a recession. With many of their stores closed, shopping centers looked dismal going into the holiday season. It was not altruism that brought the landlords around. Shermax had a significant number of stores in shopping centers across Canada, and none of the landlords wanted to add more vacancies to their centers, especially before Christmas. In their own interest, they did not want to see us go down, so the coincidence of the timing of our filing with the recession and the holiday season just ahead worked in our favor. That was the miracle. Had the timing been otherwise, the outcome might have been very different. Miracle number 7, negotiating with the creditors. When we filed, it caught all of our suppliers off guard because we had always paid our bills on time and we were known to be a credit-worthy company. Everyone was understandably upset. The Montreal Manufacturers Guild called a meeting of the creditors at Ruby Foos Hotel to discuss Shermax's filing for protection and to develop a strategy to deal with it. I was invited to attend that meeting if I chose to do so, and I did attend. There were hundreds of people there. Many in the crowd were very hostile and angry with me and seemed to be in a lynching mood. Some of them actually accused me of being a thief and of masterminding a bankruptcy for my own personal gain. Those accusations hurt me deeply because nothing could have been further from the truth. As I said earlier, we had bought a lot of merchandise for the fall and Christmas seasons in the hope of forcing our stores to do more business. But some of the creditors interpreted that as a ploy on my part to get their merchandise and so increase my debt to them. They figured that I had anticipated filing and that by doing so much of the debt would be erased, and I would have acquired all the merchandise for next to nothing. At one point, I went to the podium to say a few words, but the crowd would not give me a chance to say much. I must point out, however, that there were a number of creditors at the meeting who knew me well, and they knew that the accusations were untrue. Several of them, in particular my close friend Ian Carper, as well as Jack Wiltzer, the CFO of Algo Fashions, and Phil Cohen, to name a few, tried to go to bat for me, but the din was far too loud for them to have much effect. The objective of that meeting was to develop a strategy to deal with Shermax. A committee was needed as the first step in negotiating a settlement offer or proposal, but there was so much confusion they couldn't organize anything. Soon after that meeting, we started trying to formulate a proposal that would be acceptable to all parties, but we had a serious problem. There was no one to negotiate with because there was no creditors committee, and the creditors could not get their act together to appoint one. They called a series of meetings with us, but they were totally disorganized, and everyone who came had his or her own agenda. We couldn't get anything done and were literally at a stalemate. To get things moving, I hired Richter and Associates, another accounting firm, to act on behalf of the creditors. Richter was the accountant for many of the creditors, and their managing partner, John Swidler, was highly respected within the fashion industry. John managed to get them organized and put together a creditors committee. It was clear from the outset that John was going to play a pivotal role in any successful negotiation. The first proposal from the creditors committee was 100 cents on the dollar, 60 cents in cash paid over 2.5 years, and 40 cents in shares. That became their opening position. On our side, Rossignol proposed 30 cents on the dollar over 3 years. He told me that if there was any chance of surviving, we could not pay more, and he was convinced that they would accept that number. The creditors were very upset with Jacques' proposal and insisted that they would accept no less than 100 cents on the dollar between cash and shares. There was also a rumor at the time that Reitmans was making a play to buy the company from the creditors for 25 cents on the dollar, all cash. I was never sure whether there was any truth to that rumor or whether it was planted as a bargaining ploy by the creditors. When Rossignol agreed to take our case, He did so on the condition that he would be in charge of the entire process and that I would follow his lead. I had agreed to those conditions, but the Reitmans rumor worried me, and on Sunday evening when Jacques was out of town, I invited John Swidler and some creditors who were supporters and personal friends to my home to discuss that rumor. As I remember, Ian Carper, Jack Wiltzer, and Phil Cohen were there. I must confess that I panicked at that meeting and, acting out of fear, entertained a suggestion of 60 cents on the dollar over 3 years. Rossignol was very annoyed when he heard what I had done, and he told me I had probably thrown away any chance I had of surviving. So I had just put our survival in jeopardy, and it was all my doing. I allowed that number to be considered, and the number stuck. That was the number we were forced to use when we submitted our proposal to the creditors committee. Jacques was right and I was absolutely wrong. Jacques had the experience and he knew what he was doing, and I had undermined him. Pulling an end run around Rossignol and preempting him with a higher number was a bad move on my part. Even now I have no excuse, except that I still did not fully understand that it is almost impossible to beat the odds and survive after going into court protection, and that the less you commit to pay, the better your chances are of surviving. Now let me put miracle number 7 on hold temporarily. Miracle number 8, line of credit. When the factoring company put the stop credit on Shermax, and we had no alternative but to file for protection, we immediately advised our banks, and we were told that if Shermax hoped for any bank support throughout this process, we would have to appoint their choice of trustee, Arthur Andersen. They also insisted that we appoint Sen Delaney, one of Arthur Andersen's consulting arms that specialized in business turnarounds, to assist us in the restructuring of the company and to liaise with the bank regarding the ongoing viability of Shermax. Here began what would turn out to be another long and drawn-out, nerve-wracking experience. Although we did not know it at the time, and despite our agreeing to their demands, the bank's mandate to Arthur Andersen was to keep everything going until after Christmas, get the bank's $12 million out, and then allow the company to fold. When you file for court protection, you do not have to pay your creditors at large until you come to an agreement with them. However, the bank is a preferred creditor, which means that all of the money that comes in other than what goes to payroll, rent, and taxes goes to the bank first. So as soon as Arthur Andersen took control, the bank knew it was going to get its $12 million. Even though I was still running day-to-day operations, I was no longer in charge. Arthur Andersen was. Under the circumstances, it was not surprising that everyone at Shermax saw Arthur Andersen as the enemy. Meanwhile, all of the Shermax executive team and the entire financial and accounting department were working day and night with Sen Delaney to analyze the situation and determine what was needed to produce an effective restructuring plan. Eventually, we put together a plan that we presented to Arthur Andersen, showing that if we secured our deal with the landlords, rid ourselves of 40 low-performing stores, and recreated our business concepts as per our new test stores, there was a good chance to turn Shermax around. Of course, this was also conditional on our making a reasonable deal with our creditors, getting the bank's support, and implementing the Sen Delaney recommendations for reorganizing and streamlining the company. Arthur Andersen presented our plan to the bank, and in their report wrote something to the effect that Shermax management, together with Arthur Andersen's consulting arm, Sen Delaney, has prepared this plan that we believe would result in turning the company around. We are confident that Shermax can be saved, and we recommend that you give them your support. At that point, Arthur Andersen ceased being the enemy and became our ally. They were on our side. When we finally came to an agreement with the creditors' committee, we had to satisfy two conditions. First, we had to obtain a $5 million line of credit from our bank. Second, we had to reduce the annual rent for our head office and distribution facilities from $2 million to not more than $600,000. The creditors' committee submitted that proposal to the members at large for a vote to be held on December 6, 1993. After we agreed to the committee's condition, Rossignol, Landry, and I met with the bank and advised them of the creditors' condition concerning the $5 million line of credit with our bank. We said, "You have received a letter from Arthur Andersen recommending that you support us. Will we have your support for the $5 million line of credit?" We left that meeting with the impression that we would get their support. Now let me put miracle number 8 temporarily on hold too. Miracle number 9, head office facility. We had closed our manufacturing division in April, so we had already mothballed 1/3 of our head office building. Because we would be closing 40 stores, we estimated that would further reduce our space requirements by 30%, so we needed much less space. We went shopping to price a new location and found that we could rent suitable space for $600,000 a year as opposed to the $2 million it was then costing. Thus, $600,000 became the number we used in our restructuring plan. Rossignol, Landry, and I then went to see one of the principals of the company that owned our head office building and told him about the creditors' committee demand relating to the rent. We explained that we no longer needed the amount of space we had and that we could rent space that would satisfy our needs elsewhere for $600,000. So we asked him to either release us from our lease with a 6-month penalty in accordance with the new legislation or reduce our space and annual rent to $600,000. He told us he would look into it. He called us back in a few days for another meeting at which he informed us that they would be willing to reduce our annual rent to $1.6 million and would also reduce the term of the lease to 5 years from 15 years. We said, "We appreciate your offer, but it won't work because we can't survive paying that kind of rent. And in any case, $600,000 is one of the conditions of the creditors accepting our proposal. If we cannot satisfy that condition, we are out of business." He said, "I'm sorry, but that's the best I can do." At that point, Rossignol responded, "Please accept 6 months' rent to terminate the lease without going through the hassle of going to court." His response was, "No, we won't do that. You have to honor your lease, and that's the deal." And Rossignol said, "We have no alternative. I guess we'll see you in court." That was in November 1993, but we could not get a court date until March 1994. The creditors' committee agreed to recommend our proposal on the condition that we could get our rent reduced. That meant they would have to wait for a final decision until March. It also meant that even if the creditors at large accepted our proposal, we would have to live under a cloud of uncertainty until March, not knowing whether we would remain in business or not. So even if our proposal were accepted conditionally in December, it would by no means be a fait accompli. Rossignol assured me we would meet to prepare our case before we went to court. Let me now also put miracle number 9 aside temporarily, along with miracles number 7 and number 8. Miracle number 8 revisited, line of credit. Throughout October and November, our bank loan was coming down every day. On November 29th, Our account manager at the bank called a meeting with Rosanyal Laundrie and I and told us that the bank had decided not to extend Shermax a line of credit. She also suggested that we take our banking elsewhere. Rosanyal was outraged. You led us to believe we would have your support, and now that you've got your money, you're cutting us loose. And without saying another word, he got up, walked out of the office, and left the three of us sitting there. So there we were on a roller coaster again, but this time we were at the bottom of the loop looking into a dark hole. James and I went back to the office and I called Rosanyal. His secretary told me he wasn't available, and I said, "Don't tell me he's not available." He gave me 4 phone numbers and told me he's available to me 24 hours a day. He's got to be available. I have to speak to him. "Sorry," she said, "he's not available." So I asked to be transferred to my brother, and I was told that he wasn't available either. Then I asked to speak to Bram Gelfand, and he wasn't available. I eventually learned that they were all in a meeting and could not be disturbed. You can imagine how I felt, totally abandoned. The game was over. I had no bank, no $5 million credit line to satisfy the creditors, and I couldn't even speak to Rosanyal. As I understand it, what happened after Rosanyal left the bank was more or less as follows. He went back to his office and called an emergency meeting of all the partners of the firm. He told them what had just happened at the bank and obtained their unanimous agreement to deliver a message to the bank on behalf of their firm. That afternoon, Rosanyal went back to the bank and told the account manager that he was there on behalf of all the partners of his firm to tell her that the bank had acted entirely in bad faith by leading us to believe that they were going to support us when all they really wanted was to get their money out. And now that they had their money, they were pulling the plug on us. The landlords were supporting us, the creditors were prepared to support us, and everything was in place except the bank. He said the bank would be single-handedly responsible for bringing Shermax down and that his firm would not allow the bank to get away with that. He told her that the firm would do whatever it took to make the bank pay dearly if it caused Shermax to fail. Her response was, "I'll get back to you." The next day, the account manager called Rosanyal and said, "With respect to the letter you need confirming a line of credit for $5 million to show to your creditors, we will give you such a letter, but the letter is all you will get. We will not advance you any money." We passed that letter on to the creditors, and as far as they knew, we had met their line of credit condition, so another crisis was averted. Getting that letter and being able to satisfy the creditors with it, especially considering the circumstances, was truly another miracle. Miracle number 10, the vote. The next challenge was to get our proposal accepted by the creditors at large on December 6th. We wanted to get an indication of whether our creditors would accept or reject our proposal, so we sent everyone in the company responsible for purchasing to sound out their suppliers. The feedback was very disheartening because most of the creditors said they would not accept our proposal. On December 6th, we went to the creditors' meeting with our hearts in our throats. Our lives hung in the balance. There was nothing more to do. All the work done since October had brought us to this judgment day. Most of the votes were in by proxy, but a number of creditors showed up to cast their vote at the last minute. There must have been 150 people in the room. Shermax management, all of our accountants, trustees, lawyers, my wife Shirley, my brother Alex, and many of our friendly creditors. When it was time for the trustees to tabulate the vote, the room was electric with tension. Based on what our suppliers had told our buyers, I truly feared the worst. Then the vote was tabulated and announced. 97% voted in favor of the proposal. Truly, I cannot express how I felt. I was surprised, relieved, elated, and happy, and drained. I was so overwhelmed, Shirley and I went into a corner and wept on each other's shoulders. When I regained my composure and was able to circulate in the room, the atmosphere turned into a celebration. The energy was amazing, and although our future was far from secure, for a brief moment we were absolutely euphoric. My entire business life could have ended right there, but it didn't. We had won a reprieve. The creditors had accepted our proposal. In some respect, that moment was like an ending, and that point marked a new beginning. The challenges of surviving, regrouping, and rebuilding were still ahead of us, and they were enormous. But at least we had a chance. Another miracle. Miracle number 7 revisited. Negotiating with the creditors. I made a serious mistake when I preempted Jacques Rossignol by suggesting 60 cents on the dollar that Sunday evening at my home. I had put our future in jeopardy, but as things turned out, paying 60 cents as opposed to the 30 cents was a miracle in disguise. Shermax went on to become very successful, and because I paid 60 cents and not 30 cents as Jacques had wanted, I was able to hold my head high. I didn't feel guilty, and I certainly did not feel I had in any way cheated the creditors. By paying them 60 cents on the dollar, they recovered virtually all of their original costs. When Shermax was sold, in view of the price I received for the company, had I paid only 30 cents, it would have been a huge embarrassment for me, and I would never again have been able to hold my head high in my community. When I chickened out, what I had done was deemed to be a bad move, but it turned out to be a blessing that benefited everyone. Another miracle. Throughout this entire episode, even though John Swidler and the Richter team were the opposition in our negotiations, we had the opportunity to see them at work, to observe their work ethic, as well as their understanding of the retail fashion industry. We decided that we wanted them to be our accountants, if we had a future. Immediately after our proposal was accepted, we retained Richter and Associates as our accounting firm, and they remained our accountants until the day Shermax was sold. On a personal level, John Swidler became an advisor, a mentor, and a very good friend. Miracle number 9 revisited. Head office facility. We still had another obstacle to overcome relating to the creditors' conditional acceptance of our proposal, the court case with respect to our head office lease. As the weeks went by, I waited to hear from Jacques about preparing for the case, but he kept putting me off with, "Don't worry, I'm taking care of it." A week before the case was to be heard, I called him and said, "Jacques, I don't understand. You said we would meet to prepare our case before going to court, but I haven't heard from you and I don't know what's happening." "Max," he finally said, "we cannot go to court with this case because we cannot afford to lose. If we lose, the $1.6 million and the 5-year term will be off the table and we'll be back on the hook for $2 million a year for 15 years. The judge's ruling will deal only with whether or not we are bound to the lease. He will not reduce the rent. We cannot take the chance to go to court. I am negotiating and working behind the scenes, but I am telling you now that if we must, at the last moment, we will accept their offer for $1.6 million for 5 years, and we'll worry about the consequences later." On court day, Rossignol, Landry, and I were standing on the steps outside the courthouse when 3 officials representing the landlord arrived. We were ready to say we'll accept your proposal, but before any of us had a chance to say a word, one of them came over to us and said, "We accept your offer with some conditions." We couldn't believe our ears. Their conditions were acceptable and we agreed on the spot. Rossignol later told me, "I was banking on the fact that if I were the landlord's lawyer, I would not take this case to court because the legislation had not been tested, and if Shermax won the case, the floodgates would open, and as one of the largest landlords in the country, the potential cost to them could be staggering." That's what Rossignol was banking on, and that's why they accepted. We closed down part of the building and negotiated an advantageous new lease at $600,000 a year. Another miracle. Of all the times my guardian angel had looked out for me, one of the most crucial was when she brought Jacques Rossignol into my life. Jacques was truly amazing, and I cannot imagine that I could have had better or more able support from anyone than I received from him. Many people worked very hard to save Shermax during the court protection episode, but Jacques was the mastermind, and I credit him more than anyone else with saving Shermax and for giving us the opportunity to live another day. Had he not had the vision and the determination to take on and get the support of the landlords, had he not had the presence and the ability to deal with the creditors committee, had he not had the boldness and tenacity to take on the bank and our head office landlord, it would have been game over for us at any one of those points. I will be forever grateful to Jacques. Miracle number 11. Turnaround. I have said several times that it is almost impossible to survive after filing for protection unless new money is invested in the business by the existing shareholders or new investors, and if there are new investors, then the existing shareholders give up both ownership and control. In my case, I had no money to invest and no intention of giving up ownership. However, soon after we filed, the winds of fortune started to blow in our favor and business began to turn around for us. We sold off the excess merchandise we had on hand and turned it into cash. That enabled us to pay off our creditors within 30 months rather than over the full 3-year term of the settlement agreement, and that helped to change the mood of our creditors and our relationships with them. When we became active buyers again, most of our former suppliers had a chance to make back what they had lost. Not only did we survive, we accomplished the impossible. We went on to prosper without any new money being invested in the company from any source. That turnaround was truly a miracle. Miracle number 12, reestablishing sources of supply. As soon as we filed for protection, we were faced with an enormous challenge, that of surviving day by day, running a $100 million business with no bank, no credit, and most important, no source of supply. We needed merchandise in order to stay in business, but we had hurt our suppliers, and persuading most of them to accept orders from us while we were still in protection was a huge challenge. Accepting orders from us was also risky because nothing we ordered would be shipped for up to 5 months from the date of the order, and there was a strong possibility that we would not be in business when the merchandise was ready for delivery. Also, because the merchandise we ordered was to our own specifications, it could not be sold to anyone else. The challenge was for us to get the support of our suppliers and to bring them back on side so they would accept our orders and we could stay in business. We had to plead, beg, and do whatever it took to get them to take a further chance on us. Thankfully, enough of them decided to take that risk. One by one, supplier after supplier, including those who had called me unmentionable names, gave us their support. Slowly, we were able to place orders and receive shipments, and eventually our sources of supply returned to normal. Despite the importance of all the other miracles we were blessed with, this was the key to our surviving the impossible. In fact, it was a miracle that we got their support at all. Miracle number 13, keeping our people. Employees need to know that their jobs are secure. However, as our company's survival was questionable, jobs were anything but secure. That made our employees susceptible to approaches from other companies. We had to face the daunting challenge of holding on to our people. From the moment we filed, the headhunters were out in force trying to recruit our people, but we managed to ward off their attacks and keep our team intact. In retrospect, I believe it was the culture we had in place and the commitments that stemmed from that culture that produced a fierce sense of loyalty. Also, I made it a priority to keep everyone informed, and I included them in everything that was going on. I held regular phone conferences with staff all across the country. I shared the ups and downs we were going through, and I shared my commitment to survive and live another day. Actually, we lost only one senior member of our team throughout the whole ordeal. Jan Lorenz, our construction manager, came to me and said, "Max, no matter what we do, we aren't going to be building any new stores for some time, so you don't need me anymore. If I stay, I will be a burden on the payroll. I've had an offer and I think I should take it." I was sorry to see Jan go, but it made sense because I too didn't think we would be building for a while. As things turned out, however, we were building again in 4 months' time, and Jan came back to Shermax a year later, but in another position. Being able to hold on to our people as we did was the final miracle. One miracle in a lifetime is a miracle, but 13 miracles in a span of 6 months is in the realm of the impossible. Yet they all happened exactly when they needed to and in the proper sequence. If any of them had not happened when it did, Shermax would have gone under. Skeptics might question my use of miracles in describing the events surrounding our ordeal, but no one can possibly deny the extraordinary obstacles and difficulties we had to overcome. Was it luck, divine providence, my guardian angel, or were they indeed miracles? I choose to think they were miracles.